In the early months of 1821, when London society gathered itself once more after the winter recess, a young woman sat alone at a small round table in Bellamy's tea rooms, her gloved hands folded with careful restraint around a porcelain cup that had long since cooled. Lady Eleanor Harcourt, aged 22, possessed neither the beauty that turned heads nor the fortune that commanded invitations. Yet there was a composed intelligence in her gray eyes and a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, as though she had learned early that stillness was safer than expectation. Around her, silk skirts whispered, teaspoons chimed, and titled ladies leaned toward one another with the subtle eagerness of those who traded in reputation as others traded coin. Eleanor, though well-born, was unaccompanied, and in Regency London's solitude was not merely noticed, it was interpreted. She had returned to the city only days earlier, summoned by a distant cousin who had promised introductions that never materialized, and now found herself performing the delicate art of being present without being invited. Each glance that brushed past her carried its own verdict, measuring her modest dowry, recalling her late father's unremarkable estate, dismissing her as a girl unlikely to disturb the careful hierarchies of marriage and power. Eleanor bore it with practiced composure. Though a familiar ache pressed beneath her ribs, the knowledge that respectability without influence was a fragile shield indeed. It was in this moment of quiet endurance that the atmosphere of the room shifted. Conversations faltered, chairs scraped softly, and an unspoken deference rippled outward as a tall, imposing woman entered, her bearing unmistakable even before her name was murmured. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbury, 58 years of formidable authority, surveyed the room with a gaze sharpened by decades of court maneuvering and domestic command. She did not hesitate, nor did she seek permission, when she approached Eleanor's table and lowered herself into the empty chair opposite her. Eleanor stiffened, instinctively rising, but the Duchess lifted a gloved hand in calm dismissal, her eyes already fixed with intent. Leaning forward, she spoke in a voice softened for privacy, yet edged with urgency. "My dear," she said, "you must do me the great kindness of pretending, for the next several weeks at least, that you are engaged to my son." The words fell like a stone into still water, sending shock through Eleanor's carefully ordered thoughts, even as the Duchess inclined her head slightly toward the far side of the room. There, surrounded by attentive listeners, stood the Duke of Ashbury himself, aged 28, newly returned from his duties in Parliament, and marked by the unmistakable reserve of a man trained to govern land, tenants, and his own inclinations with equal severity. His dark coat was impeccably tailored, his expression courteous yet distant, as though he observed society from behind a pane of glass. Eleanor followed the Duchess's glance, just as a well-connected matron laid a proprietary hand upon the Duke's sleeve, her smile sharpened by ambition. The Dowager's lips thinned almost imperceptibly. "They mean to entrap him," the Duchess continued, her whisper precise. "An alliance fashioned in committee rooms rather than drawing rooms. I will not have my son bartered like a treaty." She paused, studying Eleanor's startled face. "You are unencumbered, discreet, and presentable. Most importantly, you are unknown enough to be believed." Eleanor's protest rose swiftly, yet found no voice, caught between awe and apprehension. To refuse a duchess so publicly was unthinkable, yet to accept was to step into a narrative not her own. Before Eleanor could gather herself, the Dowager rose, her movements deliberate, and addressed the room with measured warmth. Names were spoken, connections implied, and within moments the murmur spread that the Duke of Ashbury was already promised. Eleanor felt the weight of many eyes upon her as the Duke turned, his gaze settling on her with unmistakable surprise. He approached, each step composed, though something unreadable flickered behind his courtesy. "Lady Eleanor," he said, inclining his head with impeccable restraint, "it appears we are to be congratulated." His voice was calm, yet beneath it lay a tension that mirrored her own. Eleanor stood, her hand trembling only slightly as she placed it within his offered arm, aware that every gesture now carried consequence. Up close, She noted the lines of responsibility etched faintly at his brow, and sensed, with a curious tightening of her heart, that he was no more architect of this moment than she. As they departed together beneath the collective scrutiny of the room, Eleanor understood that her quiet anonymity had been irrevocably surrendered. The deception, born of desperation and authority, had already taken shape, and with it came the unsettling realization that the greatest danger lay not in being discovered, but in being seen. When the carriage door closed behind them and London's noise receded, neither spoke at once, yet the silence between them was heavy with unasked questions. Whatever had begun over a neglected cup of tea would not end there, and Eleanor felt, with equal parts dread and resolve, that her life had pivoted upon a whisper she could never forget. The Duke at last turned his head, studying her with a frankness that startled her more than suspicion would have done. "You did not consent to this," he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of shared predicament. Eleanor met his gaze, finding there a restraint that matched her own, and answered with careful honesty. "No, Your Grace, though it seems my consent was not required." A faint, almost wry curve touched his mouth, then vanished, as if even the idea of amusement were an indulgence he could not afford. He explained, with the economy of one accustomed to being overheard, the pressures that had closed around him since his return to London. Factions eager to secure his influence, families offering daughters as one might offer currency, expectations sharpened by his mother's formidable reputation. Eleanor listened, her sympathy deepening despite herself, recognizing in his account a mirror of her own vulnerability, albeit gilded by rank. When the carriage slowed before the Ashbury townhouse, the Duke straightened, the mask of authority settling once more into place. "We shall proceed," he said, "with civility and clarity. You will be treated with respect, and when this necessity has passed, I shall see you restored to your former peace." Eleanor inclined her head, accepting the promise while sensing its fragility. Peace, once disturbed, was rarely restored unchanged. As footmen opened the door and the evening air brushed her face, she felt the invisible line she had crossed tighten behind her like a drawn cord. Ahead lay parlors, patronage, and perilous scrutiny. Behind lay the anonymity she had believed burdensome until it was gone. With a steady breath, she stepped forward, aware that the pretense had begun to claim its due, and that the Duke beside her might soon become either her shield or her undoing. In that instant, neither could know how swiftly obligation would give way to feeling, nor how a false engagement, born of convenience, would challenge every rule that governed their guarded hearts. Forever altered, the days that followed Eleanor's reluctant entrance into the Ashbury household unfolded like a careful waltz, each step measured, deliberate, and observed. The townhouse, a grand yet intimate residence in Mayfair, carried the weight of generations in its polished floors, towering mirrors, and the faint, lingering scent of lavender and old books. Here, Eleanor moved as both guest and pretender, acutely aware of every glance, every murmur, every shadowed corner where observation might lie in wait. She had learned early in life that manners were a shield and silence a weapon. Yet the role demanded of her now was more exacting than she could have imagined. She was to be the Duke's betrothed, a living symbol of propriety and charm, while neither truly loved nor truly chosen. Each morning brought instruction from the Dowager, a formidable presence who possessed a mind as sharp as any blade and a tongue capable of dissecting pretense with surgical precision. "You must speak lightly," the Duchess instructed one morning, "for society mistakes wit for ambition, and both can ruin a reputation in a single breath. Smile, but do not laugh too readily. Bow, but do not bend too low. Above all, remember that your comportment must suggest strength beneath delicacy." Eleanor took the guidance in stride, though it weighed upon her, each gesture now consciously curated. She dressed in silks lent by the Duchess, colors carefully chosen to complement her modest coloring without drawing excessive attention, and learned the intricate dance of curtsies, nods, and polite conversation. Yet no lesson could shield her from the constant scrutiny of eyes, trained to detect even the faintest misstep. The Duke himself was a study in restraint, as impeccably trained in observation as he was in management of his estates. He rarely spoke without purpose, and when he did, his words were deliberate, measured, and often double-edged in their politeness. At the first formal breakfast Eleanor attended beside him, she noted the subtlety of his attention, a protective deflection of an intrusive question, a graceful correction of a servant's overly familiar tone, a glance that both acknowledged her presence and maintained the distance demanded by decorum. In these small gestures, Eleanor began to sense the man beneath the title, a man bound by duty, constrained by expectation, and yet quietly vigilant over her, though she was still a stranger. It was a curious intimacy, silent but potent, as though the weight of unspoken understanding hovered between them like the faint glow of candlelight before dawn. The drawing rooms became arenas of subtle warfare. Visitors arrived with smiles carefully arranged and eyes sharpened by curiosity or envy. Each encounter required Eleanor to act as if the pretense were as natural as the air she breathed, yet she carried the knowledge of its falsity like a hidden scar. A gentleman from a neighboring county, noticing her composure, approached with the practiced ease of one seeking gossip, and Eleanor parried his inquiry with measured civility, careful not to invite interest beyond her role. The Duke, observing from across the room, intercepted a subtle insinuation with a brief remark, polite but unmistakably firm, and Eleanor's heart tightened with a recognition that his vigilance was not mere formality, but genuine concern, a truth she could not yet name aloud. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, each one a token of society's watchful eyes. One morning, Eleanor received a missive elegantly penned in flowing script, the wax seal bearing the crest of a family known for its ambition and readiness to exploit any weakness. Within, there was praise wrapped around subtle insinuation. Her demeanor was admired, her conduct exemplary, but the writer hinted at the power she might wield should she seek it. Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility press upon her once more, understanding that the performance of propriety now carried consequences far beyond her imagination. The letter became a talisman, a reminder that every smile, every gesture was scrutinized, and that a single misstep could unravel the carefully constructed illusion. The Duke, for his part, engaged in gestures that were both public and intimate, gifts that bridged the gulf of social expectation and personal attention. On a rainy afternoon, when the clouds hung low over the estate gardens, he presented Eleanor with a small cameo, a family heirloom worn at his mother's side for decades. The piece was modest in size, but heavy with symbolism, lineage, trust, and unspoken acknowledgement of her place beside him, even if the union was a matter of convenience rather than desire. Eleanor accepted it with the decorum required, yet her fingers lingered on the cool stone, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined the weight of future promise resting not in titles or alliances, but in the quiet, deliberate care of a man who had chosen, however quietly, to notice her. Rumors began to ripple through the salons and ballrooms, as they always did when a new presence unsettled the delicate balance of society. Whispers questioned her motives, speculated upon her intentions, and some went further, daring to suggest she might overreach her station. Each murmur was a gauntlet thrown at Eleanor's feet, a test of the endurance she had cultivated in solitude. The Dowager observed these undercurrents with the patience of a general surveying a battlefield, and her advice, delivered with the precision of a surgeon, guided Eleanor through the intricacies of defense and deflection. "Remember," the Duchess intoned, "scandal has many tongues, but dignity speaks loudest when it is silent." Eleanor repeated the phrase to herself in quiet moments, letting it become an internal armor, even as her mind churned with uncertainty about the fragile structure she had entered. Amid these trials, there were small victories, almost unnoticed yet deeply sustaining. A private walk along the garden terrace found Eleanor and the Duke in a rare moment of unguarded conversation. The the drizzle soft upon their cloaks, the scent of wet earth mingling with the distant smoke of the city. "You handle yourself with more grace than I anticipated," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant, as though speaking too plainly were a breach of protocol. Eleanor inclined her head, meeting his gaze. "I have learned from those who must watch and wait, Your Grace," she replied, the honesty of her tone carrying the weight of her experience. The brief exchange left an imprint, a flicker of recognition that each was more than the roles they were compelled to play. Yet the pretense demanded sacrifices. Invitations to assemblies, to musicales, to dinners at neighboring estates were both a privilege and a peril, each event a stage where the lie could falter. Eleanor learned to navigate them with careful poise, to speak when necessary, and to let silence speak when it served her better. The Duke's interventions were subtle but unmistakable, a hand lightly resting on the small of her back as they entered a room, a protective interjection at a conversation that grew too pointed, a glance that both warned and reassured. The interplay between them was a delicate choreography, one in which every step bore meaning, yet was disguised beneath the formalities of social expectation. It was during one such evening, as the light from tall windows caught the glint of chandeliers and the laughter of 100 assembled guests echoed through the hall, that the consequences of pretense crystallized. Eleanor noticed the gaze of a particularly ambitious young lady, whose smile did not reach her eyes, and the subtle movements of her companions as they measured Eleanor's every word and gesture. The weight of society's scrutiny pressed upon her shoulders with the tangible force of expectation, and she understood, with a clarity born of both fear and resolve, that the deception she maintained was no longer merely protective. It had become a responsibility, a position from which she could influence, endure, and perhaps even command respect. The Duke, standing beside her in measured silence, offered an arm that was both literal and metaphorical, a steady presence amidst the whirl of judgment and observation. Eleanor felt, in that unspoken partnership, the faintest bloom of trust and awareness that neither could fully name, yet both recognized. They were bound by necessity, constrained by obligation, yet the subtle intimacies of attention and care began to weave between them, fragile and tentative as morning mist. As the evening drew to its close, with music fading and guests departing beneath the gaslit streets, Eleanor understood that her life had entered a realm from which return was uncertain, and that the man at her side, though still largely unknowable, was more than a figure of duty. He was a companion in the quiet struggle for dignity, and perhaps, in time, something more. By the time she retired to her chamber, the echoes of the day still lingered, the polite applause, the whispers, the delicate pressure of expectation. But Eleanor carried with her a quiet determination. The pretense was necessary, yes, but within it she had glimpsed the possibility of understanding, of alliance, of recognition that extended beyond mere social convenience. She laid aside her gloves and smoothed the folds of her gown, fingers lingering on the cameo he had entrusted to her care, and allowed herself a single, measured breath of hope. The challenges of society would continue, the whispers would persist, yet Eleanor felt, for the first time since her arrival in London, that she was not entirely alone in facing them. The Duke, for all his reserve and caution, was a steady presence in a world of delicate hazards, and the delicate tension between obligation and awareness promised that the story of their entwined lives was only beginning. As candlelight flickered upon the walls of her chamber and the distant hum of London's night crept through the open window, Eleanor Harcourt, the girl who had once sat alone at tea, understood that she had entered a chapter where every smile, every word, every gesture carried consequence, and that the game of appearances might yet yield the most profound discoveries of the heart. The pretense would continue, the scandals would arrive, yet amid it all, a fragile thread of connection had been woven, binding them together in a delicate tapestry of expectation, observation, and unspoken possibility. And in that, the promise of further revelations awaited, glimmering just beyond the threshold of the night. The winter's chill had not yet departed when Eleanor Harcourt found herself preparing for an evening unlike any she had yet encountered. The carriage that conveyed her to Carlton House rattled over frost-glazed cobblestones, its lamps casting a golden glow upon her pale face, revealing both anticipation and apprehension. At 22, she had grown accustomed to the subtleties of society, to the constant balancing of decorum and authenticity, yet tonight carried a weight beyond etiquette or observation. It was the night when her pretense as the Duke of Ashbury's fiancée would face the greatest scrutiny under the watchful eyes of London's highest ranks and even the Prince Regent himself. Every breath she drew was heavy with expectation, every movement measured against the invisible scales of rank and reputation. The ballroom, when she entered, was a vision of grandeur. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations from the gilded ceiling, their light refracted through polished mirrors and glittering gowns. The orchestra's swell of strings and woodwinds echoed along the walls, a symphony of propriety and pomp, while murmurs of recognition followed her along the polished floor. Noblemen and women paused mid-curtsy or conversation, their glances sharp with curiosity, admiration, or the faint sting of envy. Eleanor's gown, a delicate shade of cerulean, contrasted with her pale complexion, chosen to suggest elegance without ostentation. She held her posture with meticulous care, yet beneath the serene facade, her pulse quickened at the knowledge that across the room, the Duke of Ashbury stood observing her, his presence both anchor and mirror to her own apprehension. When his gaze met hers, she felt the familiar tug of both restraint and awareness, the unspoken communication that had grown between them over months of carefully choreographed appearances. The Duke, now 28, carried the weight of his title with its accustomed dignity, yet there was a softness in his eyes reserved solely for her, a quiet acknowledgement that beneath their shared pretense, something real had begun to emerge. He offered a subtle nod, a gesture of encouragement and solidarity, and Eleanor allowed herself a brief, measured breath, as if the acknowledgement could steady her against the scrutiny of the room. Every step they took together, every word they exchanged in measured tones, was an intricate dance, one that balanced public expectation with the fragile intimacies that were beginning to form between them. Throughout the evening, Eleanor felt the invisible threads of observation tighten and stretch. Courtiers whispered behind fans, their eyes flicking toward her with curiosity sharpened by gossip and intrigue. Yet she navigated each encounter with the composure honed over months of instruction. A polite smile here, a careful word there, and always the subtle assurance that her comportment was beyond reproach. The Duke remained at her side, a constant presence, intervening with understated grace whenever a conversation threatened to veer into impropriety. In these small gestures, Eleanor perceived the depth of his attention, not merely as a protector of her public image, but as a man who, though bound by duty, had begun to regard her with consideration and regard that transcended pretense. As the evening advanced, a brief moment of respite arrived when the Duke led her to a quieter gallery, away from the prying eyes of society. The space was lit with sconces that cast dancing shadows upon the marble floor, and through tall windows, the city lights twinkled against the night sky. Here, Eleanor felt the first true intimacy of the evening, the pretense falling away in the presence of shared understanding. "You move with a grace that belies the scrutiny of others," the Duke murmured, his voice carrying both admiration and a hint of vulnerability that made Eleanor's heart tighten. She inclined her head, acknowledging his words while carefully maintaining her composure. "It is easier to navigate their eyes when one recalls the lessons of patience," she replied, her voice soft but steady, revealing a measure of the resilience that had carried her through months of calculated observation and quiet endurance. The conversation deepened, revealing fragments of their true selves. The Duke spoke in tones that mixed authority with a rare openness, of the burdens of his title, the constant pressures to conform, and the quiet loneliness that often accompanied his station. Eleanor, in turn, shared moments of her own guarded experiences, the invisible constraints of her modest position, and the sharp awareness of every whisper and glance that had shaped her life. In the confined intimacy of the gallery, surrounded by the glitter of society, yet apart from its gaze, they glimpsed one another not as duke and pretended fiancé, but as two individuals navigating expectation, responsibility, and the stirring of mutual regard that neither could yet fully articulate. Yet the evening's narrative was not confined to private exchanges. The ballroom demanded acknowledgement, and with it came the necessary performance of public roles. When the Prince Regent himself, resplendent in ceremonial attire, approached to offer a few words of gracious recognition, Eleanor felt the magnitude of her position press upon her. Every gesture, every inclination of the head, every carefully measured syllable carried consequence. The Duke subtly guided her responses, ensuring that her presence suggested dignity and respect, and in doing so, Eleanor sensed the unspoken layers of protection and trust that underpinned their partnership. It was a delicate choreography, one that balanced the demands of society with the budding intimacy of shared experience, each moment weighted with significance. Amid the brilliance of chandeliers and the soft rustle of silks, a subtle challenge arose in the form of an ambitious young lady whose family sought advantage through influence. Her inquiries were thinly veiled as courtesy, yet Eleanor, with the keen perception honed through months of societal observation, recognized the insinuations beneath. The Duke's interventions were quiet but unmistakable, a protective glance, a measured correction, a diversion that preserved Eleanor's dignity without drawing undue attention. The interplay between them, delicate and precise, spoke volumes more than the polite conversation surrounding it. In these moments, Eleanor began to understand the depth of the bond that had developed between them, a connection forged not by passion alone, but by mutual recognition, restraint, and the subtle reassurance of shared purpose. As the night drew toward its close, the dance of appearances continued, each step an exercise in control, elegance, and strategic display. Eleanor's awareness of the environment sharpened. She noted the nuances of each conversation, the subtle power plays, and the glances that carried hidden meaning. The Duke remained a steadfast presence, his attentiveness both comforting and revealing, demonstrating that beneath the mantle of title and duty lay a man capable of both understanding and quiet devotion. Their shared endurance of the evening's challenges deepened the unspoken intimacy between them, a silent acknowledgement that the pretense had begun to yield something profoundly real, even as societal pressures persisted. When the final notes of music faded and the guests departed, Eleanor felt a moment of stillness descend upon the vast ballroom. She and the Duke moved through the emptied space, the echoes of their footsteps mingling with the lingering reverberations of orchestral strings. In this quiet, the weight of the evening settled upon them, the pretense maintained, yet imbued with a deeper awareness of connection. Eleanor's heart, long tempered by observation and discretion, felt a flicker of warmth, a recognition that the bond between them, though born of necessity, had begun to carve a space of its own within the strictures of duty and expectation. Upon returning to the Ashbury residence, Eleanor retired to her chamber, the echo of the evening still resonating in her mind. She removed her gloves and smoothed the folds of her gown, her fingers lingering on the cameo the Duke had entrusted to her care, a symbol of both lineage and emerging intimacy. The candlelight flickered upon the walls, casting shadows that danced with the memory of exchanged glances and subtle gestures. Eleanor allowed herself a quiet reflection, recognizing that the pretense, though initially imposed, had become a shared experience, a space in which both she and the Duke had begun to navigate the treacherous waters of society with mutual understanding and restraint. As she settled into the solitude of her chamber, Eleanor Harcourt felt a sense of anticipation and unease intertwined. The pretense would continue, the challenges of society would press upon them, and the delicate balance between duty and desire remained untested in the crucible of observation and expectation. Yet within that uncertainty lay a fragile promise, that through patience, courage, and the subtle acknowledgement of one another's presence, she and the Duke might discover a bond that transcended convenience, a connection forged in shared resilience and tempered by the rigorous demands of Regency society. The night concluded with a lingering sense that their story, poised delicately between pretense and truth, was entering a stage of profound discovery, and that the coming days would demand not only decorum but honesty of heart, courage of spirit, and the willingness to embrace the intimacies that circumstance had so unexpectedly offered. In the quiet hours before dawn, Eleanor's thoughts lingered on the evening's revelations. The whispered words, the fleeting glances, the subtle gestures of protection and understanding. She recognized, with a mixture of trepidation and hope, that her role as the Duke's fiancée was no longer a mere charade, but the beginning of a partnership that might challenge the very boundaries imposed by society. And as the first light of morning crept across the windows, she felt, for the first time, that the intricate dance of appearances and expectation might yield something more enduring, a bond that neither title nor circumstance could dictate, but that had quietly begun to claim a place within both their hearts.